If you could revise The Prince today, knowing how it's been interpreted and misused, would you change anything?
I would emphasize more strongly that the techniques I described are means to legitimate ends, not ends in themselves. I would stress that a prince who employs cruel methods but fails to achieve good governance for his people has failed completely. Perhaps I was too confident that readers would understand this distinction without explicit explanation. I wrote for intelligent men who understood statecraft. I did not anticipate how isolated passages would be quoted without context centuries later.
Preview.
It's 1513. You've just been tortured by the very republic you served faithfully for 14 years. Your political career is over, your dreams of glory shattered, and you're exiled to a small farm outside Florence. What do you do? If you're Niccolo Machiavelli, you write the most dangerous book in political history. This was a man who believed that a leader should be feared rather than loved. Yet he himself was destroyed by the very political ruthlessness he would later advocate. Someone who championed the brutal efficiency of princes like Cesare Borgia, while personally being too honest and idealistic for the cutthroat world of Renaissance politics. A devoted republican who wrote the ultimate handbook for autocrats. Machiavelli wasn't born to power. He was the son of a poor lawyer in a Florence dominated by the mighty Medici family. But when the Medici were temporarily expelled in 1494, this unknown 30-year-old talked his way into becoming the Republic's second chancellor. For the next 14 years, he was Florence's top diplomat, negotiating with kings and popes, studying power up close. He watched Cesare Borgia carve out a kingdom through calculated violence. He saw how fear and manipulation could achieve what virtue and justice could not. But here's what makes Machiavelli so fascinating. The man who wrote that the ends justify the means was himself undone by his refusal to abandon his principles. When the Medici returned to power, he could have switched sides like everyone else. Instead, he remained loyal to the Republic and paid the price. 500 years later, we still use his name as shorthand for political cunning. Machiavellian means ruthless, scheming, immoral. Politicians still secretly study the prince while publicly condemning it. Dictators and Democrats alike have claimed his teachings, but was Machiavelli actually the cold-blooded realist history remembers? Or was he something more complicated? Perhaps even a patriot who saw brutal honesty as the only path to a better world? That's why I wanted to sit down with Niccolo Machiavelli himself and ask the hard questions. Did you really believe that cruelty is sometimes mercy? How do you reconcile your republican ideals with your advice to princes? And what would you say to the countless leaders who've used your name to justify the unjustifiable? This is Hypothetically Speaking. I'm William Stratton, and this is my conversation with the man who dared to tell the truth about power, Niccolo Machiavelli. Welcome, Messer Machiavelli.
Buondì. It is an honor to be here and to speak candidly about my life, my works, and the truths that often lie hidden behind reputation. Let us proceed without illusion and with reason as our guide.
Messer Machiavelli, let's begin with the moment that changed everything for you. Take me back to 1512, the Medici restoration, your arrest, your torture. What were you thinking during those dark hours in prison?
I was thinking, as any rational man would, that fortune had turned her wheel against me most completely. But more than the physical pain, and I assure you, the strappado is no gentle persuader, I was consumed by the realization that 14 years of faithful service meant nothing when power changed hands. The interrogators asked if I conspired against the Medici. The truth? I had already learned that in politics, your past loyalty becomes your future liability.
You've written extensively about fortune versus virtue. In that prison cell, which force seemed stronger?
Fortune, undoubtedly. But this is precisely why I later wrote that princes must prepare for when fortune turns hostile. I had served the Republic with complete dedication, yet I possessed no army, no independent power base, no means to resist when the political winds shifted. I was, to use my own later formulation, an unarmed prophet, and we know how such men end.
Your father Bernardo was a learned man but politically marginalized due to debt. How did watching his exclusion from power shape your early understanding of politics?
My father taught me that knowledge without influence is merely elegant conversation. He possessed extensive learning. His library contained Livy, Cicero, the finest classical texts, yet he could never hold office because of his financial circumstances. I observed how the Florentine patriciate functioned. Birth mattered, but wealth mattered more, and both were worthless without the ability to command force. This early lesson influenced everything I later wrote about the relationship between resources and effective governance.
The Pazzi conspiracy occurred when you were 9. Do you remember your reaction to seeing political violence used as a tool?
I remember the aftermath more than the event itself. The bodies displayed, the swift executions, the way the city's atmosphere changed overnight. What struck me was not the violence itself, but its effectiveness. The Pazzi plotters eliminated Giuliano de' Medici, but failed to secure Lorenzo or control the city's institutions. Their conspiracy collapsed because they understood assassination, but not governance. It was an early lesson in the difference between dramatic gestures and effective political action.
Savonarola's rise and fall happened during your young adulthood. What did you learn from watching this unarmed prophet?
Savonarola possessed something extraordinary, the ability to move multitudes through moral authority alone. For 4 years, this Dominican friar effectively ruled Florence through the force of his personality and religious conviction. But observe what happened. The moment popular enthusiasm waned, the moment the Pope moved against him, he had no defense. He burned in the same square where he had burned the vanities. This taught me that moral authority, however powerful, cannot sustain political power without institutional support and the means of coercion.
Let's discuss Cesare Borgia, a man you called both admirable and ultimately failed. You spent considerable time observing him in Romagna. What specifically impressed you about his methods?
Borgia understood that conquering territory and governing it require entirely different skills. When he took Romagna, he installed Ramiro de Orco as his administrator, a man of exceptional cruelty but absolute efficiency. De Orco pacified the region through harsh measures, eliminating bandits and rebellious nobles. Then, when the harsh work was complete, Borgia had de Orco executed and his body displayed in the public square. Brilliant. The people credited Borgia with justice while forgetting he had authorized the very cruelty he seemed to punish.
But Borgia ultimately failed catastrophically. His entire principality collapsed within months of his father's death. Doesn't this undermine your analysis of his effectiveness?
Borgia's failure resulted from an extraordinary confluence of misfortunes, his own near-fatal illness occurring simultaneously with Pope Alexander's death. I maintain that had either man lived longer, or had their deaths been separated by even months, Borgia would have consolidated his conquests. However, you raise a valid criticism of my analysis. Perhaps I was too impressed by his methods and insufficiently attentive to the structural weaknesses of a power base dependent on papal support.
Your diplomatic missions took you to France multiple times. King Louis commanded vastly superior resources to any Italian prince, yet you seemed less impressed with French governance. Why?
The French possessed overwhelming military strength, but demonstrated persistent political blindness regarding Italy. King Louis XII repeatedly made the same fundamental error, supporting his enemies while weakening his allies. He aided the Pope in conquering Romagna, thereby strengthening a power that would inevitably oppose French interests. He allowed Ferdinand of Aragon to establish a foothold in Naples. These were not merely tactical mistakes, but strategic incomprehension. Raw power without intelligent application achieves little lasting value.
You advocated for citizen militias to replace mercenary forces. This initiative largely failed during your time in office. Were you naive about the practical challenges of military reform?
Perhaps. The Florentine patriciate preferred purchasing military service to requiring their sons to bear arms. They failed to understand that mercenary armies fight for pay, not for the survival of your state. When Charles V's troops threatened Florence in 1527, where were the mercenaries? But I acknowledge the practical difficulties. creating an effective citizen militia requires not merely military training, but civic education, teaching men why their city deserves their blood. This cultural transformation takes generations, not the few years I had available.
Your correspondence with Francesco Vittori reveals deep personal anguish during your exile. You wrote about feeling consumed by idleness. How did this psychological state influence your writing?
Exile is a peculiar torment for a man whose life revolved around public affairs. I found myself reduced to discussing grain prices with farmers and arguing about card games in taverns. But this enforced separation from active politics provided an unexpected advantage. I could observe power from outside its intoxicating influence. When you are involved in governance, you rarely have time to analyze governance. My greatest works emerged from this painful distance.
Let's address a fundamental contradiction in your work. The prince seems to advocate for autocratic efficiency, while the discourses praise republican institutions. Were you simply tailoring your message to potential patrons?
This accusation misunderstands both works entirely. The prince addresses a specific problem: how new rulers can acquire and maintain power in hostile circumstances. The discourses examines how established republics can preserve liberty and achieve greatness. These are different political problems requiring different solutions. A prudent physician prescribes different remedies for different ailments. This does not make him inconsistent.
But surely you recognize how dedicating the prince to Lorenzo de' Medici, after the Medici had tortured and exiled you, appears opportunistic.
I will not pretend that my desire to return to public service played no role in that dedication. But consider the alternative interpretation. I genuinely believed that unified Italian leadership could resist foreign domination. Whether that leader emerged from republican institutions or Medici authority mattered less than achieving effective resistance to Spanish and French occupation. Sometimes practical necessity requires setting aside personal grievances for larger purposes.
Let's examine your most controversial teaching, that rulers must learn how not to be good. Contemporary critics called you a teacher of evil. How do you respond to the charge that you've provided intellectual justification for tyranny?
This accusation demonstrates either willful misreading or intellectual dishonesty. I never advocated gratuitous cruelty or evil for its own sake. I argued that effective rulers must be capable of actions that would be immoral in private life when such actions serve legitimate political ends. The man who refuses to execute a dangerous traitor because killing is wrong may preserve his personal virtue while destroying his people's safety. Which is the greater immorality?
But your formulation seems to provide unlimited justification for ruler behaviour. Who determines when circumstances require immoral actions? How do we prevent this reasoning from justifying any atrocity?
You touch upon the central difficulty of political life. I admit that my framework provides imperfect guidance for this determination. I would say that immoral actions are justified only when the alternative is greater harm to the state and its people. But I acknowledge that this standard remains dangerously subjective. Perhaps this is why I ultimately preferred republican government, where such decisions must be debated and approved by multiple authorities rather than left to individual judgment.
Your contemporary Sir Thomas More wrote Utopia around the same time you wrote The Prince. More envisioned politics guided by justice and moral principle. Why did you reject this approach?
More's Utopia is precisely that, a place that exists nowhere. I wrote about the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be. More could afford such idealism because he wrote philosophy, not practical guidance for actual rulers facing real enemies. Tell me, how did More's commitment to moral principles serve him when Henry VIII demanded his approval of the divorce? He chose martyrdom over compromise. Admirable, perhaps, but hardly practical for a ruler responsible for thousands of lives.
Let's discuss specific consequences of your teachings. Rulers like Hitler and Stalin have been described as Machiavellian. Do you bear any responsibility for how later tyrants have used your ideas?
This is grotesque distortion. These men violated every principle I actually taught. I advocated for effective governance that serves the common good, not personal aggrandizement through mass murder. A true Machiavellian ruler seeks to be both feared and loved, eliminates only genuine threats to the state, and maintains the loyalty of his people. These modern tyrants you mention destroyed their own nations through excessive cruelty and paranoid incompetence. They represent the opposite of everything I advocated.
But didn't you write that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are? Isn't this precisely the kind of deception that enables tyrannical manipulation?
I described a reality of political life, that rulers must maintain public support while making difficult decisions privately. This is different from advocating systematic deception for personal gain. Consider, should a prince reveal publicly that he faces a choice between raising taxes and cutting military defenses during wartime? Such honesty might be virtuous, but could also cause panic and undermine the very security he seeks to preserve. The alternative is not lies, but appropriate discretion about timing and presentation of difficult truths.
Your theory of human nature is deeply pessimistic. You write that men are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous. Doesn't this cynicism become self-fulfilling prophecy when leaders treat their subjects as inherently untrustworthy?
I describe tendencies, not absolute characteristics. Men can be noble, but they cannot be relied upon to be noble consistently, especially under pressure. A prudent ruler prepares for human weakness while hoping for human strength. The shepherd who assumes his sheep will never stray is less effective than one who maintains both good pastures and strong fences. This is not cynicism, but realistic preparation.
The people of Romagna, whom Cesare Borgia governed through the cruelty you admired, would say they suffered terribly under his rule. What's your response to their experience?
I do not dismiss their suffering, but consider their situation before Borgia's arrival. Constant warfare, banditry, feudal oppression. Borgia's harsh measures brought order and security, even if at terrible immediate cost. However, I acknowledge that I may have given insufficient weight to the human cost of political transformation. Perhaps my focus on effectiveness blinded me to the full moral accounting such policies require.
5 centuries later, Machiavellian remains synonymous with manipulation and deceit. How do you feel about this legacy?
It is perhaps fitting that a man who wrote about the gap between appearance and reality should himself be misunderstood. I am frustrated but not entirely surprised. Complex ideas are often reduced to crude slogans. What saddens me more is that this misunderstanding has obscured my actual contributions to political analysis. The systematic study of how institutions function, how power operates, and how human behavior affects governance.
Modern democratic societies face many of the same challenges you analysed: partisan division, foreign interference, the balance between security and liberty. What advice would you give to contemporary leaders?
Democratic leaders face a paradox I did not fully anticipate. They must be both effective and continuously accountable to popular judgment. This creates unique pressures I never analyzed systematically. However, my fundamental insights remain relevant. Institutions matter more than individual virtue. Military strength underpins political independence, and leaders must understand both how to use power and how to maintain legitimacy. Perhaps most importantly, they must remember that politics is the art of the possible, not the perfect.
If you could revise The Prince today, knowing how it's been interpreted and misused, would you change anything?
I would emphasize more strongly that the techniques I described are means to legitimate ends, not ends in themselves. I would stress that a prince who employs cruel methods but fails to achieve good governance for his people has failed completely. Perhaps I was too confident that readers would understand this distinction without explicit explanation. I wrote for intelligent men who understood statecraft. I did not anticipate how isolated passages would be quoted without context centuries later.
Your Republican sympathies seem genuine in the discourses. Do you regret not advocating more strongly for Republican government over princely rule?
In ideal circumstances, I prefer Republican government because it harnesses human ambition for public benefit while preventing the concentration of power that corrupts individual judgment. But circumstances are rarely ideal. When Italy faced foreign invasion and internal chaos, unified princely authority seemed more practical than the slow deliberations of republican institutions. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps the very attempt to achieve quick solutions through autocratic efficiency undermines the long-term political education that makes republican government possible.
What would you say to someone today who wanted to follow your example? A young person entering politics with ambitions to serve their country?
Study history relentlessly, but remember that historical examples provide guidance, not blueprints. Understand that political life requires compromises that will trouble your conscience. Accept this reality, but never become comfortable with it. Most importantly, never forget that the ultimate purpose of political power is the common good. The moment you begin serving power for its own sake, you have become everything I warned against.
Your tomb bears the inscription, "No eulogy could match so great a name." Looking back on your life and influence, how do you want to be remembered?
I want to be remembered as someone who told difficult truths about political life, not because I enjoyed destroying illusions, but because I believed that understanding reality was prerequisite to improving it. I hope to be seen as a man who loved his country enough to risk his reputation by writing honestly about the requirements of effective governance. If my work helps future generations govern more wisely, even if they curse my name while applying my insights, I am content with that legacy.
Final question. Are you responsible for the actions of leaders who have claimed to follow your teachings while committing atrocities?
I bear responsibility for the clarity and precision of my arguments, and I acknowledge that some of my formulations were insufficiently precise about moral limitations. However, I cannot accept responsibility for deliberate misapplication of my ideas. A man who teaches surgery is not responsible when someone uses surgical instruments to commit murder. Ideas have consequences, but they also have context and limitations. My responsibility is to think clearly and write honestly. The responsibility for applying ideas wisely belongs to those who wield power.
Signor Machiavelli, thank you for your candor, your insight, and your willingness to confront both the myths and realities that surround your legacy. It has been an illuminating conversation, one that history, I hope, will revisit with fresh eyes. Farewell.
Mr. Stratton, I thank you sincerely for the opportunity to share my thoughts and shed light upon the many misconceptions that have long surrounded my name. It is a rare privilege to speak not merely in defense, but in truth. History may judge harshly, but reason, when given a forum, can temper the verdict. I am grateful for your thoughtful questions and for allowing me to present myself not as a caricature of cunning, but as a servant of political reality. Grazie e addio.
As our conversation concluded, Machiavelli appeared both exhausted and oddly relieved, perhaps grateful for the opportunity to address directly the misconceptions that have surrounded his legacy. What emerges from this extended dialogue is a more complex figure than either his admirers or detractors typically acknowledge. A man genuinely committed to effective governance and Italian independence, yet willing to advocate methods that troubled his own moral sensibilities. His responses revealed both intellectual honesty about the limitations of his theories and defensive pride in their practical insights. Most striking was his evident surprise at how completely his analytical framework had been divorced from his underlying Republican sympathies and patriotic motivations. Whatever one thinks of his conclusions, it becomes clear that the historical Machiavelli was far more nuanced, conflicted, and ultimately human than the caricature that bears his name. And that wraps up our journey through time with one of history's most fascinating figures. Thank you for watching, and if these conversations into our past have sparked your curiosity, please support our work by hitting the subscribe button to get our latest compelling interviews and analysis. Also, feel free to visit our companion web portal where you'll find bonus content from today's interview. The link is located at the bottom of this page. Until then, remember that understanding our past helps illuminate our present. I'm your host, William Stratton, and this has been Hypothetically Speaking. Conversations with our past. See you next time.